In the autumn of 1887, the Nebraska sandhills held a deceptive peace. The tall grass, cured by the sun to the color of old gold, whispered promises of a bountiful harvest and a mild winter. It was a lie, and Alara, barely a woman at 19, could feel the falsehood in her bones. The ache was a phantom limb, a cold space left by the sudden departure of her husband, Liam, taken by a fever that had swept through the settlement of Prosperity Creek like a prairie fire. She was now a widow, a word that sat on her shoulders with the weight of a burial shroud. She was alone on a quarter section of land that was not truly hers, shackled to a banknote that Liam had signed with a hopeful flourish, and which now felt like a gravestone marking the death of their dreams. The community's wisdom, a currency traded over fence posts and in the general store, was singular and unyielding. A man built a house of sod, cut from the earth in thick, heavy bricks, or, if he had means, of logs hauled from the distant Niobrara River. A man heated this house with an iron stove, a squat, black idol that demanded a constant tithe of firewood. This was the way. It was the only way. The master of this wisdom was Mr. Silas Croft, a man whose spine was as unbending as the steel rails of the new railroad. He was the town's foremost builder, the land agent for the bank, and the arbiter of what was and was not possible on the unforgiving prairie. His own house was a testament to his authority, a 2-story log structure, the largest in the county, with glass windows and a porch from which he could survey his domain. He saw the world as a collection of problems to be solved with muscle, timber, and iron. He looked at Alara and saw a problem he could not solve, and therefore, one he must dismiss. He saw a wisp of a girl, her hands too slender for an axe, her frame too slight to wrestle sod bricks. He saw a liability. Alara felt his judgment, and the judgment of the town, like the constant pressing wind. They looked at her and saw only what was missing: a husband, a son, a future. They did not see the grit hardening in her heart, a quiet, desperate geology of resolve. They saw a fading photograph, a woman already becoming a ghost on her own land. The old-timers, men whose faces were maps of past droughts and blizzards, ignored the warm autumn sun. They watched the muskrats building their lodges with unusually thick walls. They noted the woolly bear caterpillars with their narrow, ominous bands of orange. They pointed to the early, heavy migration of geese, their honking calls sounding like a frantic farewell. They spoke in hushed tones of the winter of 1871, the year of the 2 winters, when the snow came in October and did not leave until May. This year, they whispered, felt the same. The air itself felt thin, brittle, as if waiting to shatter. Alara listened. She had always been a listener, a watcher. While other girls had learned stitches and scripture, she had learned the language of the clouds and the habits of the prairie dog. Her grandmother, a Cherokee woman whose wisdom was dismissed as folk nonsense, had taught her to read the land. Now, the land was telling her to be afraid. The conventional wisdom of Prosperity Creek felt like a thin blanket against a coming ice age. The log cabins, for all their sturdy appearance, were drafty. The seams between the logs were a constant battle against the wind, a battle that was always, eventually, lost. The soddies were damp and dark, little better than burrows, and just as susceptible to the cold. And the iron stoves? They were voracious beasts. She had seen men spend their entire autumns cutting, hauling, and splitting wood, only to see their monumental woodpiles vanish in a few short weeks of true, deep cold. The stoves gave a fierce, direct heat that rose straight to the ceiling, leaving the floors frigid, and as soon as the fire died, the cold rushed back in as if it had never left. It was a flawed system, a cycle of desperate, unending labor for a temporary and unreliable comfort. It was a way of fighting the prairie, of trying to dominate it with fire and iron. Alara sensed, with a certainty that frightened her, that this was a fight the prairie was destined to win. Her own dwelling was a mockery of the word shelter. It was a small, dilapidated soddy Liam had built as a temporary measure, a place to exist while he cut the wood for a proper cabin he would never have the chance to build. The roof leaked, the walls crumbled, and the wind treated the door as a minor inconvenience. It was a place to die, not to live, and Mr. Silas Croft knew it. He arrived one crisp October morning, his horse a magnificent black creature that seemed to radiate disapproval of the humble surroundings. Croft did not dismount. He looked down at Alara from his elevated position, his face a mask of grim propriety. He held a leather folio in his gloved hand. "Mistress Alara," he began, his voice devoid of warmth, "the bank has reviewed your situation. Your late husband's note is past due." Alara said nothing. She just stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, her gaze steady. "It is the bank's position," he continued, as if reciting a verdict, "that you lack the means to secure this property against the coming winter. This structure," he gestured dismissively at the soddy, "is inadequate. It is a hazard. You have no significant woodpile, no husband, no prospect of either." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "This is not a life for a woman alone. It is a sentence." He opened the folio. "The bank is prepared to be lenient. We will foreclose, naturally, but we will forgive the outstanding debt. In exchange for the deed, I am personally prepared to offer you $50 for your husband's tools and the livestock. It is more than fair. It will be enough for a train ticket back east to whatever family you might have." Alara's family was a collection of unmarked graves in a churchyard in Ohio. She had no one. This land, this quarter section of grass and sky, was all that was left. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear. Croft almost smiled. It was the condescending twitch of a man who believes he is dealing with a foolish child. "Then the terms of the note are explicit. You must demonstrate significant improvement to the property. You must construct a permanent, habitable dwelling before the first deep snow. Failure to do so will result in immediate foreclosure, and you will be removed with nothing." It was an impossible ultimatum. To build a log cabin required a team of men, a wagon, weeks of labor hauling timber, and skills she did not possess. He was not giving her a chance. He was formalizing her failure. He was sentencing her to exile, confident that the verdict was just and the outcome inevitable. He would get the land, with its valuable creek access, for the pittance of a forgiven loan. "I see," Alara said. "I trust you will be practical," Croft said, closing the folio with a snap. He glanced at the small, neat pile of cottonwood logs near the soddy, the sum of Liam's final efforts. "I will give you $5 for that wood. It will hardly last you a fortnight, but it will be of use to a family that can survive the winter." That was the final cruelty. He wanted to strip her of her last source of warmth, to hasten the end he had already decreed. "The wood is not for sale," Alara said, "and I will not be selling my land." For the first time, a flicker of genuine surprise crossed Croft's face, quickly replaced by irritation. "That is your decision. Do not come to me when the snows fly. This is a matter of business, not charity. You have been warned." He turned his horse and rode away, leaving Alara standing in the long shadow of his certainty. She was alone, with a death sentence for a home and an execution date set by the weather. Despair washed over her, cold and vast as the prairie sky. She retreated into the dim, crumbling soddy and sat on the dirt floor, the dust of failure coating her skin. She had nothing. Or so she thought. The next days were a blur of grief and fear. She moved through the motions of survival, tending her small garden, milking her single cow, but her mind was a whirlwind. How could she possibly build a house? With what? With whose help? The task was monumental, impossible. The weight of it pressed down on her until she could barely breathe. She began the sorrowful task of packing Liam's few possessions, his worn clothes, his carving knife, his book of psalms. In the bottom of his small wooden chest, beneath a folded wool shirt, her fingers brushed against something hard and unfamiliar. It was a book. Not a printed book, but a small journal bound in cracked, dark leather, tied shut with a leather thong. It was not Liam's. The handwriting on the inside cover, when she finally worked the knot free, was a delicate, looping script. Katerina Petrenko, 1852. Liam's grandmother. A woman who had come from the vast, wind-swept steppes of Ukraine, a place Liam had said was much like Nebraska. Endless grass and a sky that hated you. The family had spoken of her as Old Katerina, a strange woman who clung to old ways, who built her oven out of mud and sang songs in a language no one understood. She had died long before Alara had met Liam. The journal was filled with that same script, a mix of Cyrillic letters and phonetic, heavily accented English. It was a diary, a cookbook, a book of memories. And then Alara found it. A section of 20 pages, complete with detailed, meticulous drawings. The heading, written in careful English, read, "To build a warm house where there is no wood." Her heart began to beat faster. She sat on the floor, the autumn light slanting through the dusty air, and she read. Katerina wrote not of fighting the winter, but of embracing it. Not of generating endless heat, but of capturing and holding the little heat you had. She wrote of the samanka, the traditional earthen houses of her homeland, but she described a crucial adaptation she had seen used on the treeless plains, using the grass itself. The principle was breathtakingly simple. Wood, Katerina explained, was a poor insulator. A log wall, no matter how thick, readily transferred the cold from the outside to the inside. The secret was not in solid mass, but in trapped air. Millions of tiny pockets of air captured in the hollow stems of dried grass. The drawings showed it clearly. A foundation of fieldstone. Upon this, a wall not of logs or sod, but of tightly compressed bales of straw or hay, stacked like enormous bricks. She described how to cut the native bluestem grass in late summer when its stalks were thick and hollow. She detailed how to use a hand press to create dense, heavy bales, each one a self-contained unit of insulation. The journal was a blueprint from a forgotten world. The bales were to be stacked in a running bond, like masonry, for strength. Long, sharpened wooden stakes were to be driven down through the bales from the top, pinning them together into a solid, monolithic wall. And then came the most important part: the skin. The bales, vulnerable to moisture and fire, were to be encased, inside and out, in a thick plaster made from clay, sand, and water, with more chopped straw mixed in as a binder. Katerina called it earth plaster. This coating, several inches thick, would make the walls airtight, fire-resistant, and durable. The final piece of the puzzle was the source of heat. Katerina scorned the iron stove as a hungry ghost that eats wood and gives nothing. Her drawings showed a peach, a masonry heater. It was a massive, intricate structure of brick and clay built into the center of the small house. It was designed to be fired hot and fast, for only an hour or two a day. The complex, winding path of the flue gases inside the heater would transfer the fire's intense heat into the hundreds of pounds of masonry. The fire would go out, but the heated mass would then radiate a gentle, steady warmth for the next 24 hours. It heated the structure, not just the air. The walls themselves, with their incredible insulating properties, would hold that warmth. The house Katerina described was not a fortress against the winter, but a living thing. It was a thermos, a warm coat, a hibernating bear. It worked in concert with nature, not against it. It used the most abundant and overlooked materials on the prairie, the grass underfoot, the clay from the creek bed. Alara read the pages again and again, her hands trembling. It was brilliant. It was logical. It was, she knew with a bone-deep certainty, the only path to survival. It was also madness. To the people of Prosperity Creek, building a house from hay would be the ultimate act of folly. They would not just mock her. They would think she had lost her mind to grief. She looked around the crumbling soddy. She thought of Silas Croft's smug, certain face. She thought of the coming cold, the wind that would claw at the walls, searching for a way in. She closed the journal. She had her answer. She began that very day. The first task was acquiring a hay press. She had no money, but she had Liam's tools, his good German steel saw, his chisels, his hand plane. She hitched her lone ox to the cart and made the journey to the next settlement over, where she would not be known. She traded the tools, the physical legacy of her husband, for a rusted but functional hand-operated press. The farmer who took them looked at her with pity, certain he was getting the better end of the deal. Alara felt a pang of loss, but no regret. A tool was only as good as the hands that used it, and these tools were meant to build a house of wood she could never have. She was building a different future. Then came the labor. It was a physical trial unlike anything she had ever known. Day after day, from sunrise to sunset, she was in the fields, cutting the tall blue-stem grass with a scythe. The rhythmic swing and slice became the new cadence of her life. Her back screamed in protest. Her hands, soft from a life of domesticity, were soon a raw landscape of blisters that broke, bled, and hardened into calluses. The sun was relentless, the horseflies merciless. She was a solitary figure in a sea of grass, a tiny engine of relentless effort. She would cut for hours, then spend hours feeding the dried grass into the maw of the press. It was a clumsy, heavy machine. She would stuff the chamber, then walk the long wooden lever arm in a circle, the ox plodding beside her, turning the screw that compressed the grass into a dense, tight block. When the bale was finished, she would tie it with twine she had bought with her egg money, then heave the 70-pound block onto a growing stack. Each bale was a victory. Each one was a brick for her fortress. The work was isolating, but it was also clarifying. The physical exertion burned away the fog of her grief, replacing it with the sharp, clean focus of purpose. Her body changed. The soft lines of her youth hardened into the lean, ropey muscle of a laborer. She grew thin, but it was the thinness of a whipcord, not of a willow. She ate standing up, slept the dreamless sleep of the utterly exhausted, and rose before the sun to do it all again. As the pile of golden bales grew, so did the whispers. Silas Croft made it a point to ride the boundary of his own extensive property, a route that took him right past Alara's land. The first time he saw her, wrestling with the scythe, he merely shook his head in pity. The next time, seeing the hay press and the first dozen bales, he reined in his horse. "Mistress Alara," he called out, his voice thick with amusement. "Putting up fodder for the winter? A wise choice, though I fear you have more hay there than your one cow could eat in a decade." "It is not for the cow, Mr. Croft," she said, not pausing in her work. He watched her for a moment longer, a slow, dawning look of disbelief on his face. He let out a short, barking laugh. "Good heavens, girl! You can't be serious. You're not thinking of building with it?" Ilara simply continued her work. His laughter followed him as he rode off, and it was the herald of her new reputation. Within a week, the story was all over Prosperity Creek. The poor widow had finally cracked. She was building a house of hay. Ilara's Folly, they called it. The Haystack House. It became a local joke, a source of grim entertainment. Men would ride out on a Sunday after church just to stare and point. They saw a woman, filthy with sweat and dust, engaged in a mad, impossible project. They saw proof of female hysteria, of a mind unsuited to the rigors of the frontier. She ignored them. She had no energy for shame or anger. Every ounce of her being was focused on the task. She laid a foundation of flat stones, dug from the earth and hauled on a crude stone boat. This was back-breaking work, levering the heavy rocks from the ground, wrestling them into place, ensuring the foundation was level. It took her 2 weeks. Then came the walls. She began to stack the bales, one by one, like a child building with giant blocks. The first course went down, then the second, staggering the joints for strength. The walls rose with surprising speed. The small 12 by 16-foot rectangle took shape in just 2 days. It was a strange, temporary-looking thing, a house of bound grass. The mockery intensified. "A single spark, and she'll go up like a torch," one man said to another, loud enough for her to hear. "The wolves will huff and puff and blow her house down," another joked, and the men laughed. Even the preacher, Reverend Miller, felt compelled to intervene. He arrived one afternoon, his Bible in his hand, his face a mask of pious concern. "My child," he said, his voice soft and patronizing, "this is not the way. Pride goeth before a fall. The Lord provides for his flock, but he does not reward such eccentricity. There is still a place for you in the church lean-to. Accept your lot. Do not build this monument to your own stubbornness." "I am building a house, Reverend," she replied, her arms aching from hammering sharpened ash stakes down through the layers of bales. "God gave us the grass and the clay. I believe he intended for us to use them." The Reverend left, shaking his head, convinced he had just spoken to a woman in the grip of a dangerous delusion. The most difficult part was the plaster. She dug the clay from the banks of the creek, a thick, gray, sucking mud that fought her every step. She hauled it, bucket by heavy bucket, back to the building site. She mixed it with sand and water and chopped straw in a shallow pit, wading into the cold, slimy mixture and treading it with her bare feet for hours, the way Katarina's journal described, until it was the right consistency. Then, with her hands and a small wooden trowel, she began to apply it to the walls. It was messy, grueling work. She pushed the thick plaster deep into the surface of the hay, forcing it into every crevice, creating a powerful bond. She worked her way around the outside, layer by thick layer, until the golden bales disappeared completely beneath a seamless, sculpted, earthen skin. She did the same on the inside. The house was no longer a stack of hay. It was a solid, monolithic structure. The walls were nearly 2 feet thick. She left openings for a single door and 2 small, deep-set windows on the south-facing wall, just as the journal instructed, to capture the low winter sun. Inside, she began the most intricate work of all, the masonry heater. Using fired bricks she had traded her mother's locket for, and a mortar of clay and sand, she painstakingly followed Katarina's diagrams. She built the firebox, the baffles, the winding flue that would snake back and forth inside the heater's mass. It rose in the center of the small room like an altar. When it was finished, she gave it a final, smooth coat of plaster. By the time the first flakes of snow began to drift down in late November, the house was complete. It looked like nothing else on the prairie. It was low and solid, its corners rounded, its surface the color of the earth itself. It seemed to have grown from the ground rather than been built upon it. To the people of Prosperity Creek, it was alien and absurd. To Alara, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was the physical manifestation of her will to live. She moved her few possessions inside. The air within was different. It was still and quiet. The 2-foot-thick walls muffled the constant moan of the wind to a barely audible whisper. The deep-set windows framed the stark landscape like paintings. The packed earth floor was cool underfoot. She built a small fire in the masonry heater, just a handful of wood. The fire roared for an hour, then burned down to coals. But hours later, the brick and clay mass of the heater was still radiating a gentle, pervasive warmth that filled the small space. It was not the scorching, temporary heat of an iron stove. It was a deep, abiding warmth, a warmth that felt as if it were coming from the heart of the house itself. The first snows were light. The winter settled in, cold and stern, but manageable. Croft rode by, saw the smoke rising from her chimney, and snorted in derision. "She's just burning through her hay, one bale at a time," he told the men at the general store. "The first real storm will tear that mud hut apart." They all agreed. They waited for her failure with the grim satisfaction of those whose own wisdom has been publicly challenged. They waited for the prairie to deliver its verdict. And on January 12th, 1888, the prairie obliged. The day began with a strange and unsettling warmth. A Chinook wind blew from the southwest, melting the thin layer of snow on the ground. The temperature rose to above freezing. Children, released from their winter confinement, went to the one-room schoolhouse without their heavy coats. Farmers, deceived by the thaw, let their livestock wander far from the barns. It was a day of false hope, a treacherous smile from a merciless sky. Around 3 in the afternoon, the world changed. A low, dark wall of cloud appeared on the northwestern horizon, a churning, bruised purple mass that moved with unnatural speed. The warm wind died abruptly, replaced by a dead, electric calm. Then, the cold hit. It was not a gradual cooling. It was a physical blow, a solid wall of Arctic air that dropped the temperature 50 degrees in less than an hour. The sky did not darken to gray, but to a terrifying, absolute white. The snow that came was not in flakes, but in a fine, granular powder like sand, driven by a wind that rose to a deafening, soul-shaking roar. It was not a storm, it was a cataclysm. A blue norther, the old-timers called it. Later, it would be known as the school children's blizzard, for the dozens of children who, caught unawares, would freeze to death on their way home. In Prosperity Creek, the failure of conventional wisdom was swift and total. The wind, a solid force moving at 70 miles an hour, attacked the log cabins. It forced the fine, sharp snow through the tiniest cracks in the chinking, around the window frames, under the doors. Soon, little drifts of snow were forming inside the houses. The iron stoves, which had been idling in the morning's warmth, were now stoked to their absolute limit. They glowed a dull red, consuming seasoned oak and cottonwood at a terrifying rate. Yet they could not fight the cold. The single-pane glass windows became sheets of thick, crystalline frost. The walls leached warmth, the logs acting as conduits for the bitter cold outside. Inside Silas Croft's fine two-story house, a scene of desperate battle was unfolding. He and his two sons were constantly feeding the massive cast-iron stove in the main room and the smaller one in the kitchen. The wood pile he had thought would last until March was shrinking before his eyes. Despite the roaring fires, the temperature in the room plummeted. 40 degrees. 35. The ink froze in the inkwell on his desk. His wife Mary had bundled their 3 youngest children in every blanket they owned and pushed them as close to the stove as she dared. But they were still shivering, their faces pale and their lips tinged with blue. "More wood, Silas!" she cried over the scream of the wind. "This is the last of the split oak!" he yelled back, his voice tight with a fear he had never before known. He was the master builder. His house was the best. It was supposed to be a fortress. But the fortress was falling. The wind was an invading army, and his fires were a pathetic, failing defense. He could feel the house losing. The cold was a palpable presence, an enemy that was already inside the walls, inside the room, seeping into their bones. By the second day, the wind had not slackened. It was a constant, high-pitched shriek, the sound of a world being torn apart. Croft's wood was gone. The fires died. The temperature inside the house dropped to match the temperature outside. It was 10 below zero. Frost began to form on the blankets covering his children. He was failing them. His knowledge, his strength, his certainty, it was all useless. He was going to watch his family freeze to death in the finest house in the county. And then, a thought, born of pure desperation, pierced through his fear. The widow, Alara. He pictured her in her pathetic little soddy, a structure he had condemned. Then he remembered the strange mud hut she had built instead. He had laughed at it. Folly. A haystack house. She had a small wood pile, the one he had tried to buy from her. In his arrogant mind, a new, terrible certainty formed. She must have frozen to death on the first night. Her house, that ridiculous pile of grass and mud, must have been torn to pieces by the wind. But her wood would still be there. A small pile, but enough to rekindle his fires, enough to last until the storm broke. It was a grim hope, but it was the only one he had. "I'm going out," he told his wife. "You can't!" she sobbed. "You'll die!" "We'll die if I don't," he said, his voice raw. He pulled on every layer of clothing he owned until he could barely move. He wrapped his face in wool, leaving only a slit for his eyes. He took a coil of rope and tied one end to the porch railing. He would follow the fence line to Alara's property. It was only half a mile, but in this whiteout, it might as well have been 100. The moment he stepped off the porch, the world vanished. There was no up, no down, no land, no sky. There was only the white, roaring chaos and the savage, biting cold. The wind tore at him, a physical, malicious force that stole his breath and tried to rip him from his feet. He stumbled forward, his gloved hands feeling for the familiar fence posts, his only guide in the featureless hellscape. Every step was a battle. The snow, as fine and hard as sand, blasted his exposed skin, raising welts. His eyelashes froze together, his breath froze in his scarf, forming a block of ice against his mouth. He thought he was going to die. He, Silas Croft, the master of the prairie, was going to be found in the spring, a frozen statue a few hundred yards from his own home. The irony was a bitter acid in his throat. He thought of Alara. He had condemned her to this, and now, in a final, desperate act, he was trying to rob her corpse. He fell, got up, fell again. He lost track of time. He was an automaton, driven only by the image of his children's blue lips. Finally, His hand hit a different kind of post, one of the corner posts of her property. He was close. He crawled the last 50 yards on his hands and knees, expecting at any moment to run into a snow-covered pile of hay and rubble. Instead, his hand touched something smooth and hard and vertical. A wall. He looked up, squinting through frozen lashes. Before him was a low, curved shape, a white dome against the white chaos. It was the house. It was still standing. A thick, insulating blanket of snow had drifted over its roof and against its north and west walls, integrating it even further into the landscape. And then he saw it, the sight that shattered his understanding of the world. From a small clay chimney on the roof, a thin, almost invisible plume of heat haze rose and was instantly torn away by the wind. It was not the thick, desperate smoke of a stove burning at full fury. It was the calm, steady exhalation of a gentle fire. He was hallucinating. It wasn't possible. He crawled to the door and, with the last of his strength, banged his fist against the wood. The sound was swallowed by the storm. He banged again, a frantic, hopeless rhythm. He was going to die right here, on her doorstep. Then, he heard the sound of a latch being drawn. The door swung inward, and the world changed again. He fell from a universe of white, screaming violence into a pocket of absolute stillness and warmth. The air that washed over him was not just warm, it was soft, gentle, and carried the impossible, dizzying scent of baking bread. Elara stood there, framed in the doorway. She was not bundled in furs or huddled over a fire. She wore a simple wool dress, its sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her face was calm. Behind her, the small room was bathed in a soft golden light from a kerosene lamp. There were no drafts. There was no roar of the wind, only a distant, muted whisper, as if the storm were happening in another country. On a small table, a loaf of bread was cooling, and on the wall, a small brass-cased thermometer, a luxury Liam had insisted on buying, registered a temperature that Croft's frozen mind could barely comprehend. 68 degrees. He stared, dumbfounded. The contrast between the hell he had just crawled through and the serene sanctuary he had stumbled into was so profound, so absolute, that it broke something inside him. All his certainty, all his expertise, all his pride crumbled into dust. Elara looked at the ice-caked monster collapsed in her doorway and saw not the man who had condemned her, but simply a man who was freezing. Without a word of reproach, without a single "I told you so," she helped him inside and shut the door on the storm. She helped him out of his frozen outer layers, her movements efficient and calm. She sat him down on a small stool near the massive clay and brick heater. He reached out and touched its plastered surface. It was not hot, but deeply, wonderfully warm, radiating a steady, life-giving heat. She handed him a steaming mug of broth. He drank it, the warmth spreading through his chest, chasing away the deadly chill. He looked around the small room. It was a haven. The thick, plastered walls seemed to glow with warmth. The air was fresh and still. Finally, he found his voice. It came out as a ragged croak. "My family. My children. The wood is gone. We're freezing." Elara simply nodded. She went to the corner and pulled out a small sled. Beside it was a coil of rope, with knots tied every 10 feet. Katarina's journal had described it, a guide rope strung between the house and the barn, an essential tool for navigating in a whiteout. Ilara had strung one all the way to her property line. She put on a heavy coat and wrapped her face, her movements betraying no panic, only purpose. "Stay here. Keep the fire fed," she said, pointing to a small wood box. It contained only a few dozen small logs. It seemed an impossibly small amount of fuel. She handed him another log. "Add one of these every 4 hours." And then she was gone, out into the storm that had nearly killed him. A small, determined figure heading into the white abyss to save the family of the man who had mocked her, condemned her, and left her for dead. Croft sat there, stunned into silence, sipping the broth. He watched the firebox of the masonry heater. A few small logs burned merrily, the flames licking up into the hidden, winding channels of the structure. It was a fire no bigger than what one might build for pleasure on a cool autumn evening. And yet it was heating this entire space, effortlessly holding the most savage blizzard in living memory at bay. An hour later, the door opened again. Ilara returned, not alone. She had Mary Croft and the 3 youngest children with her. They stumbled in, half frozen and weeping with relief, their eyes wide with the same disbelief that he had felt. Ilara settled them with blankets, gave them broth, and then, without resting, turned to go back out. "The Reverend's family," she said simply. "Their cabin is on the way. I saw their smoke stop this morning." She went out again, and again. Over the next several hours, Ilara's folly, the haystack house, became Ilara's ark. She brought back the Millers. She brought back the Olson family, whose soddy had partially collapsed. Her small 12 by 16-foot home was soon filled with 12 people, the very pillars of the community who had ridiculed her. They huddled together, a silent, chastened congregation, their lives dependent on the wisdom they had dismissed as madness. They watched her. They watched as she moved with quiet competence, tending to the children, portioning out her small store of bread and stew. They watched as, every few hours, she would open the firebox and add 1 or 2 small pieces of wood to the bed of coals, and the house remained warm, a steady, even, miraculous 68 degrees. Silas Croft finally stood up and walked to the wall. He pressed his hand against the interior plaster. It was not cold, like the walls of his own house. It felt neutral, almost faintly warm to the touch. He ran his hand over the smooth, curved surface. 2 feet of grass and mud, 2 feet of insulation that had defeated the Arctic. He thought of his own log walls, 8 inches of solid, frozen timber that were acting like a pump, sucking the life and heat out of his home. He turned to Ilara, who was checking on his sleeping daughter. He was the master builder. He was the voice of authority. He was a man who had never admitted to being wrong in his entire adult life. His voice was thick with an emotion he could not name. It was shame. It was awe. It was the painful, liberating feeling of a lifetime of certainty being washed away. "How?" he asked. It was not just a question. It was a plea, a surrender. "I was wrong," he said, the words tasting foreign in his mouth. "I called this folly. I said you would die. But we were the ones dying. In my house. My fine, strong house. This is wisdom. You have saved us. How?" Reverend Miller, huddled with his family, looked up, his face etched with a profound and humbling shame. "The girl spoke of using the gifts God gave us," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We laughed at her. Lord, forgive my arrogance. We were the fools." The blizzard raged for 3 days. For 3 days, 12 people lived in Alara's tiny house, a warm, safe island in a sea of frozen death. When the wind finally died and the sun emerged, glinting off a world transformed and buried, the survivors of Prosperity Creek emerged from their cold, dark homes. The story spread faster than a prairie fire. The story of how Silas Croft and the preacher and the Olsons had survived. They had been saved by the mad widow. They had taken refuge in Alara's folly. In the aftermath, the full toll of the storm became clear. Lives had been lost. Livestock was decimated. But the story that was told and retold was one of survival, of a wisdom that had been hiding in plain sight. Alara's status was transformed overnight. She was no longer the pitiful outcast. She was a sage, a savant, the woman who understood the winter. A week after the storm, Silas Croft came to her door again. He did not ride his magnificent horse. He walked, his hat in his hands. He did not stay on the path. He came to the door and stood before her, a humbled, changed man. He brought with him the deed to her land, the bank seal across it stamped, "Paid in full." He also brought a formal apology from the bank's board and an offer of a permanent stipend, an investment, he called it, in the future of the community. "We were wrong," he said again, meeting her eyes. "Not just wrong. We were blind. Arrogant. Will you teach us? Will you show us how to build like this?" Alara did not hesitate. She did not hoard her knowledge or savor her victory. That was the way of men like the old Croft. Her way, the way of her grandmother, the way of Katarina Petrenko, was to share. She brought out the cracked leather journal and opened it on the table. That spring, a new kind of building began in Prosperity Creek. With Silas Croft acting as a repentant but highly efficient foreman, the men of the town learned to cut and bale the prairie grass. They learned to mix the earth plaster, to stack the walls, to orient the houses to the south. They learned the intricate, brilliant geometry of the masonry heater. They learned not to fight the prairie, but to listen to it. They called them Alara houses. They were warm in the winter, cool in the summer, and so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat. They were built from the earth they stood upon, and they stood for generations. Decades later, long after Alara had passed, a young architect from Chicago, traveling through Nebraska, came upon the town. He was struck by the unusual architecture, the low, rounded, earth-colored homes that dotted the landscape. He inquired at the local historical society and was shown a fragile, leather-bound journal and told the story of the Hay-Bale widow, the young woman who, in the face of mockery and condemnation, had listened to the wisdom of an ancestor and saved a town. Her original cabin still stood, preserved as a monument. It was no longer a folly, it was a touchstone, a testament to the simple, profound truth that sometimes the most powerful innovations are not born of new technologies, but of rediscovered wisdom. It was a legacy not of timber and iron, but of grass and clay and the unyielding resilience of a single, quiet woman.